The night was restless along the ancient stones of the Great Wall, as if the wind carried whispers from centuries ago. Daniel Carter walked alone, his lantern swaying with each step, shadows stretching unnaturally along the wall's surface. He paused when he felt the ground vibrate faintly beneath his boots, a shiver racing through him. Sarah Miller had warned him that meddling with the past invited danger, yet his obsession for truth silenced reason. A distant echo like a buried heartbeat pulsed from beneath the stones, and the air grew cold enough to sting his lungs. Daniel Carter said, "If secrets lie beneath these walls, they will not remain hidden from me." The silence that followed felt heavier than the stone itself. Morning stretched pale across the stones, while Daniel Carter's mind clung to the night's pulse beneath the wall. Sarah Miller confronted him beside their small tent, worry trapped in her eyes. Sarah Miller said, "You can't treat this place like a vault you can pry open." He answered, with quiet iron, "History hides because we let fear write the rules." Villagers walked past with baskets and glances that slid away, their murmurs forming a fence of warnings. To them, the wall was not only defense and dynasty, but oath and ancestor, a boundary between what breathes and what should not. Sarah Miller said, "If you keep digging, something will answer." He stared at the stones and felt the truth pressing back, as if the ground itself remembered. By noon the air turned brittle, and arguments sharper. Sarah Miller said, "People vanish for less than what you're chasing." Daniel Carter smiled without warmth, eyes fixed on distant watchtowers. Daniel Carter said, "If fear kept the truth safe, the world would still be dark." Mark Evans arrived with rolled notes and mud-stained sketches, reluctance fighting the excitement in his voice. Mark Evans said, "These markings you found predate the earliest bricks by centuries." The words struck like a bell. Sarah Miller said, "Older than the wall means older than the story we tell." Daniel felt the terrain of certainty tilt beneath his feet, not as a warning but as a summons. The stones seemed to listen. Mist thickened after dusk, until the wall looked like a spine under low cloud. From that grayness stepped Lucas Zhang, face half hidden, steps measured as if counting heartbeats. Lucas Zhang said, "You're asking the wrong question. The wall was not built to keep them out." Daniel Carter didn't breathe. Lucas Zhang added, "It was built to keep something in." Sarah Miller's whisper caught. Sarah Miller said, "Why bring this to us?" He placed a worn map in Daniel's hand, the parchment traced with symbols that felt like wounds. Lucas Zhang said, "Follow the marks, but remember the truth eats the ones who feed it." He slipped back into the fog, and the silence tasted like metal. Under a thin sliver of moon, Daniel Carter traced the map's markings and matched them to the wall's hidden seams. Sarah Miller said, "He's baiting you." Daniel answered, "He gave us coordinates only the stone would recognize." Far along the ridge, a solitary figure stood unmoving, as if carved from night. Elizabeth Wren watched with a patience that felt like ownership. Elizabeth Wren said, "He is walking toward something that will not let him leave." The wind tucked her words into the mortar. Daniel felt the weight of an unseen ledger opening, and for the first time the wall seemed less like a monument than a mouth. The morning wind rattled the banners along the wall, as Daniel Carter unrolled the map again, his finger tracing the inked sigils. Sarah Miller said, "You still believe that Stranger's warning was help, not a trap?" Daniel's voice cut steady, "Truth doesn't care who delivers it." Mark Evans crouched over the stones, charcoal sketch in hand, muttering about alignments older than dynasties. The villagers gathered near the ridge, their faces pale with recognition, whispering names of forgotten kings. A deep vibration hummed through the ground, faint but undeniable, stirring dust that glittered in the light. Daniel Carter said, "This place is waiting to be opened." His eyes burned with conviction, even as Sarah's unease spread like cracks through stone. By midday the stones groaned like an old beast stirring in sleep. Mark Evans said, "The geometry points to a hollow chamber beneath this section." Sarah Miller snapped, "And if that chamber was sealed for a reason?" Daniel Carter pressed his palm flat against the wall, the vibration answering his pulse. He felt both fear and triumph, a strange marriage of obsession and destiny. The villagers began to chant old warnings, words carried from ancestor to ancestor, voices quivering as though reciting spells. Daniel Carter said, "History does not belong to silence." His voice echoed louder than he intended, and the chanting stopped. Even the wind seemed to bow out. That night the air was colder, the moon's face blurred behind drifting cloud. A hollow clang echoed through the wall, as if some inner passage had shifted. Sarah Miller whispered, "That was no echo. Something moved." Daniel Carter unrolled the map beneath lantern light, studying symbols that pulsed like veins of fire in his imagination. Mark Evans said, "If we push further, we may not return." Daniel answered, "Then we'll carry the truth with us, wherever we end up." Sarah's silence hurt more than her protests. The stone breathed with them, alive, patient, waiting for permission to speak. The ground near the battlement shifted, revealing a seam no one had noticed before. Daniel Carter pried at it with iron tools, sparks flicking off stone. Sarah Miller grabbed his arm, voice sharp. Sarah Miller said, "If you open it, you can't close it." He shook free, driven, relentless. Mark Evans muttered, "Ancient mortar, yet the gap is fresh." The villagers refused to come closer, murmuring of curses, their eyes fixed on the dark line splitting open. Daniel Carter said, "This wall was never meant to keep secrets safe forever." And with one final strike, the seam shuddered open wider. As night swallowed the wall again, the breach gaped like a wound. A draft rolled out, colder than the night itself, carrying the scent of rust and earth. Sarah Miller whispered, "It's breathing." Daniel Carter stepped closer, lantern trembling in his grip, though his face betrayed no fear. Mark Evans said, "This isn't just stone. It's a threshold." Daniel Carter said, "Then we step through." His words echoed in the breach as though something deeper answered. For the first time Sarah wondered if truth itself could be a predator. The breach yawned wider at dawn, mist curling like smoke from a furnace of ages. Daniel Carter gripped his lantern tighter, voice steady but eyes flickering with awe. Daniel Carter said, "This is more than a wall. It's a doorway." Sarah Miller stood at the edge, her breath visible in the icy air. She muttered, "Doorways go both ways." Mark Evans studied the patterns etched into the stone, noting how the carvings aligned with the map. His hands trembled, not from cold but from the weight of discovery. The villagers refused to approach, standing in clusters, muttering of sleeping guardians. Inside, the passage dropped sharply, rough stone steps carved into darkness. Sarah Miller said, "This isn't construction, it's excavation." Daniel Carter's lantern revealed markings, faded but deliberate, spirals meeting at jagged points. Mark Evans whispered, "Geometry of sacrifice. This was not for defense." Sarah's fingers traced a groove too smooth to be natural, shuddering as she pulled back. Daniel pressed on, footsteps echoing against hollow walls. The deeper they went, the louder the silence became, until their breathing was the only sound alive. At last, the stair ended in a vast underground chamber, cold and alive with shadows. The chamber stretched wide, its ceiling lost in darkness. Piles of rusted chains lay scattered, half buried in earth. Sarah Miller said, "Prison or altar?" Daniel Carter whispered, "Maybe both." Mark Evans knelt to examine a cracked urn, brushing away soil to reveal fragments of bone. He swallowed hard, closing the urn again. Strange markings circled the chamber walls, their meaning lost but their menace alive. The villagers outside began chanting again, faint but audible, as though afraid silence might invite attention. Sarah shivered and said, "Something here remembers." Daniel set the lantern in the center, flame trembling violently. A sudden vibration shook dust from the ceiling, raining down over their heads. Mark Evans cried out, "It's shifting again!" Sarah Miller pulled Daniel back, eyes filled with dread. "This isn't discovery," she hissed. "It's awakening." Daniel refused to yield, his gaze locked on a fissure across the chamber where faint light pulsed like a beating heart. He said, "That's the source. We came here for truth, and there it waits." His words rang hollow against the walls, swallowed quickly as if the chamber resented his intrusion. The lantern's flame bent sideways, pulled by an unseen breath. The fissure widened with a sound like iron tearing. A gust escaped, colder than any mountain wind, carrying the smell of old ashes. Sarah Miller whispered, "We should never have come." Daniel Carter stepped closer, his voice barely above a murmur. "But we did." Mark Evans clutched his notebook, his scribbles turning frantic as he tried to capture symbols that shifted when he looked at them twice. Sarah grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "You can't write what shouldn't be remembered," she said, trembling. The glow pulsed once more, illuminating carvings of chained figures stretching upward. The chamber's glow dimmed, then surged, lighting symbols that twisted like serpents along the stone. Daniel Carter whispered, "It's not history carved here, it's warning." Sarah Miller stepped closer, her hand trembling as she traced one figure bound in chains, eyes wide with horror. She said, "They weren't guarding invaders. They were holding something in." Mark Evans' breathing grew ragged, his notes falling to the ground as he muttered, "Containment. Centuries of silence." The ground rumbled once more, cracks spreading beneath their feet. Daniel squared his shoulders, determination hardening in his expression. "Then silence just ended," he said. The fissure widened, stone breaking away as though pulled by invisible claws. A hollow roar filled the chamber, not heard but felt in their bones. Sarah Miller shouted, "It's alive!" Daniel Carter held his ground, forcing calm into his voice. "Alive doesn't mean unbeatable." Mark Evans stumbled back, clutching his chest, muttering that the air itself was wrong. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward the fissure. The villagers' chants outside grew louder, desperate, a wall of fear barely holding against what stirred below. Daniel lifted the lantern high, casting trembling light against the dark, as if daring it to answer. The lantern flame sputtered and went out, leaving only the pulsing glow from the fissure. In the dark, the carvings shimmered like living things. Sarah Miller whispered, "We're not supposed to be here." Daniel Carter forced his voice steady, though his hands shook. "We're already here. We can't turn back." Mark Evans' notebook slipped from his grip, pages scattering, covered in frantic symbols that seemed to move on their own. A sudden sound echoed, a low hum, not of stone, but of something waking, remembering. Sarah pressed her back against the wall, her voice breaking. "Daniel, this isn't knowledge, it's a tomb." The fissure gave way, revealing a black void that seemed deeper than the earth itself. From it, a sound like chains dragging across stone filled the chamber. Daniel Carter clenched his jaw and stepped closer. Whatever was buried, it's calling. Sarah Miller grabbed his arm with desperation. "And you're answering," she said, trembling. Mark Evans staggered back until he hit the wall, his voice rising in panic. "This is what the villagers feared. This is what they prayed against." The chains rattled louder, as though something vast shifted in the dark. Daniel whispered, "Then prayers were enough." The ground split violently, throwing them to their knees. From the fissure, a burst of icy air swept through the chamber, extinguishing even thought for a moment. Sarah Miller coughed, eyes watering, gasping, "It wants out." Daniel Carter rose slowly, lantern clutched though dark. He whispered, "And we want truth." Mark Evans shook his head violently, his voice cracking. "No truth is worth this." The carvings flared one last time, bathing the chamber in ghastly light. Every chained figure on the wall writhed as though straining against bonds. Sarah's tears shone in the glow as she whispered, "Then we're already too late." The chamber's glow dimmed, leaving streaks of pale light pulsing like veins in stone. Daniel Carter whispered, "This was never built to protect. It was built to imprison." Sarah Miller stared at the fissure, tears streaking her face. She said, "Imprison what, Daniel? What could terrify them so much they'd build a wall across a continent?" Mark Evans slumped against the wall, scribbling symbols with frantic strokes. His voice cracked. The wall isn't defense, it's a seal. Daniel stepped closer to the shifting glow, his face hardened. And seals break, he muttered, determination edging into dread as the chamber trembled. The villagers chanting outside grew louder, echoing into the chamber like a desperate warning. Sarah Miller grabbed Daniel Carter's arm and cried, "We should leave before it swallows us." Daniel shook his head, his voice low but unwavering. "We came for truth. And it's here." Mark Evans shouted, "Truth? This is madness." He held up his notebook, pages filled with spirals and jagged lines, his hand trembling. "These aren't translations, they're instructions. Instructions for binding something that never should be free." Daniel turned slowly toward the fissure, his expression unreadable. "Then why does it sound like it's calling me?" A low rumble echoed, and the fissure widened further, glowing symbols spilling onto the floor. Sarah Miller pressed her hands against her ears, whispering, "It's not just sound, it's inside my head." Mark Evans fell to his knees, dropping the notebook, his voice hollow. "It wants a name. It wants release." Daniel Carter closed his eyes, steadying his breath. He whispered, "Names have power. If it has one, it can be bound again." Sarah shook her head violently, her voice breaking, "Or set free." Daniel's lantern flame flared without touch, burning white. The chains in the carvings rattled in unison. The temperature dropped so sharply their breath fogged in the air. Sarah Miller clutched Daniel's sleeve, her whisper sharp. "If you speak its name, you'll never come back." Daniel Carter looked at her, eyes hollow, yet resolute. "Then staying silent will doom us all." Mark Evans staggered forward, his face pale and wet with sweat. He cried, "You don't understand. It doesn't want to be bound. It wants to bind you." A guttural sound rolled through the fissure, so deep the stones themselves shook. Daniel raised the lantern, its glow straining against the dark. He said, "Then I'll answer carefully." The fissure exploded with light, blinding them as the ground shuddered violently. Daniel Carter shielded his eyes, whispering through the roar, "Show me." Sarah Miller screamed, "No," and lunged toward him, but the force knocked her back. Mark Evans clawed at the wall, shouting, "We were never meant to open it." In the glare, shapes moved, towering figures bound in chains of fire, writhing against unseen bonds. A voice, ancient and broken, filled the chamber, echoing within their bones. "Release." Daniel's hand shook around the lantern, but his eyes stayed fixed forward. He whispered, "Not release, reveal." The chamber shook like a living heart, its beat pulsing in the walls. Daniel Carter gasped. This wall wasn't a monument, it was a coffin. Sarah Miller crawled toward him, her voice breaking, "And you've cracked it open." Mark Evans pressed his forehead to the stone, whispering, "The builders knew. They begged the future not to repeat this mistake." Outside, the chanting turned to screams as villagers fled into the night. Daniel raised the lantern, its white flame piercing the dark. "We've uncovered something no empire could ever bury forever," he said, his voice shaking with awe and dread. The fissure split wider, revealing an abyss glowing with chains of molten fire. Sarah Miller screamed, "Close it, Daniel, please." Daniel's voice cracked as he said, "I can't, it's awake." Mark Evans staggered backward, clutching his chest, gasping, "It's feeding on us." The sound grew louder, a chorus of broken voices, echoing names they had never spoken aloud. Daniel whispered, "It knows me." Sarah shook her head furiously, terror in her eyes. "Then it will consume you." The walls groaned as dust rained down, the ceiling threatening collapse. Still, Daniel's eyes never wavered from the light spilling through. The light shifted, forming shapes of towering figures with chained limbs straining against their bonds. Sarah Miller clutched her head, sobbing, "They're not human." Mark Evans groaned, collapsing to his knees. "They're older than words." Daniel Carter stepped forward, his hand trembling around the lantern. "Then why show themselves now?" A voice like wind over stone whispered, "Because you called us." Daniel stiffened, whispering, "Not me. The wall itself." The chains burned brighter, each rattle shaking their bones. Sarah cried, "Then the wall isn't protection, it's pleading for help." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And no one has answered for centuries." The voice grew louder, shaking the walls. "Release us." Daniel Carter shouted back, "Why were you sealed?" Silence fell, broken only by Sarah Miller's gasps and Mark Evans' sobs. Then, slowly, the answer came, "Because we are the builders, and we are betrayed." Daniel's eyes widened as he whispered, "The wall wasn't built to keep something out. It was built to keep them in." Sarah screamed, "Then stop listening." She pulled at his arm, but the lantern flared blinding white, as though resisting her. Mark Evans muttered through clenched teeth, "If they built it, what did they fear even more?" The chains clattered violently as the chamber cracked. A blinding beam erupted skyward, splitting the night. Villagers outside fell to their knees, weeping. Daniel Carter shielded his eyes, whispering, "This is no secret, it's a warning." Sarah Miller collapsed, her voice hoarse, "Then let it stay buried." Mark Evans clawed at the floor, screaming, "It's too late, it sees us." In the roaring light, the chained figures rose higher, their shadows clawing the walls. One voice thundered above the rest, "If we fall, the wall falls." Daniel, trembling yet resolute, whispered back, "Then I'll hold it together even if it kills me." The night split open above the wall, as the beam of light pierced the heavens. Daniel Carter whispered, "If the wall breaks, the world breaks with it." Sarah Miller clutched his arm, crying, "You're not strong enough to hold them." Mark Evans rasped, "None of us are." Yet Daniel stepped forward, his lantern burning brighter than ever, a beacon defying the abyss. The chained figures loomed, their voices like thunder and whispers entwined. "Release us, or perish as they did." Daniel's breath shook, but his resolve hardened. "No," he said. "I'll keep the secret, but not in silence. The world will know." The chamber floor cracked beneath them, revealing a chasm that stretched into infinity. Sarah Miller screamed, "Daniel, the ground's giving way." Mark Evans crawled backward, his voice breaking, "It's choosing who survives." Daniel Carter dropped to one knee, gripping the lantern with both hands. He cried out, "I am not your jailer. I am your witness." The chained figures paused, their forms flickering like smoke in the light. Sarah, trembling, whispered, "Did they hear you?" The voices thundered in unison, "We remember." Then silence fell, oppressive and absolute, as if the wall itself held its breath. The silence broke with a single sound, the lantern shattering. Daniel Carter gasped as shards scattered, but the white flame hung suspended in the air. Sarah Miller cried, "It's alive." Mark Evans shielded his face, shouting, "Don't touch it." The flame pulsed like a heart, then split into countless sparks that raced along the chamber walls, igniting carvings unseen before. The figures roared in pain, their chains tightening, binding them deeper. Daniel whispered, tears streaking his cheeks, "It wasn't meant to free them, it was meant to bind them forever." Sarah sobbed, "Then you've sealed us with them." The carvings told the story of betrayal, builders shackled by their own creation. Sarah Miller whispered, "They were punished, not worshipped." Mark Evans groaned, "The wall's a tomb." Daniel Carter clenched his fists, shouting, "No, it's a warning, and we are its messengers." Outside, villagers fell to their knees as the beam of light fractured into 1,000 stars, scattering across the horizon. The chained figures screamed, their voices fading into the earth itself. Daniel cried out, "Stay buried!" and slammed his hand against the stone. The fissure snapped shut, the chamber falling into sudden darkness. Only silence remained. The chamber lay silent, the wall whole again, but the memory carved into their souls. Sarah Miller whispered, "No one will believe us." Mark Evans shook his head weakly, "They don't have to. The wall remembers." Daniel Carter stood in the fading glow, his voice steady though his body trembled. "Truth buried this long doesn't die. It waits." He turned, eyes reflecting the stars still burning faintly in the sky. And now, so do I. Sarah grasped his hand tightly, her voice barely audible. Then we carry it together. Their silhouettes stood framed against the wall, eternal keepers of its secret.